Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, and hope you're in a warm, cozy place and not too cold today. It's pretty cold all over the country. But welcome to 2024. Welcome to PLMA. This is our first webinar of the new year, and we're really delighted to have you here with us. Here, you will be finding we are involved in what we call a load management dialogue presented by PLMA, where you will discover practitioner perspectives on flexible load management, demand response, distributed energy resources, and managed charging. Today's discussion is going to be an interesting one because it will touch on a number of different trends and opportunities that we should be keeping an eye out for in this new year. And with us today, we have two phenomenal speakers who I will turn the mic over to in just a moment. Olivia Patterson is a PLMA Executive Committee member and also works for Opinion Dynamics. Peter Kelly Detweiler is an author and a consultant, and he is the founder of Northbridge Energy Partners. And now it is my pleasure to turn the floor over to Olivia to make some introductory comments, and we'll get underway with this webinar. Welcome, and the floor is yours, Olivia.
Thanks, Judy. Can you hear me? Great. I always want to double check that when we start these things. Well, welcome everyone to the first PLMA webinar of 2024. I'm very pleased to be part of this, and we're off to a great start with lots of folks interested in exploring the trends and issues ahead for the coming year. As we proceed with today's conversation, please type any questions you have into the chat, and we'll do our best to answer these. We've got a lot of topics to cover, and we'd love to hear your feedback. Anything that we don't get to, we can always try to respond to at a further time. And so now it's my pleasure to introduce the veritable font of wisdom, Mr. Peter Kelly Detweiler. Peter, perhaps you can introduce yourself, a little bit about your background, and help set the stage for the 2024 trends conversation.
Sure. Thank you. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here once again. I've been in power markets in some way, shape, or form for 30 years. I headed up Constellation's demand response group when we started with about 60 megawatts, and by the time I left, we had 1,700 megs of dispatchable load. This is around 2010, 2011 timeframe. And since then, I've been writing and researching and trying to figure out where this whole system of systems is going to take us as we decarbonize our energy economies, which is the most significant challenge humanity has ever faced and the largest collective task we've taken on. So it's an interesting ride, and certainly DERs are going to be a critical piece of helping us do that within the electric energy sector. Oops, you just went mute.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Thanks for introducing yourself. Why don't we sort of frame up the challenge and opportunity for the energy transition as a launching pad to discuss 2024 key trends?
Sure. So we've got this power grid now, which is being asked to electrify everything. There's some thinking out there. There was a statement from one of the executives at EPRI, that Electric Power Research Institute, that if the entire Biden decarbonization plan were followed, we could have to potentially triple the size of the electricity supply and delivery system, including on-site generation. And we don't think enough about the cost of reliability and what this is all going to mean. So right now we have a system where we size for system peak. We have an expected loss of load probability once every 10 years or so. And essentially anybody who wants electricity can get it whenever they want, flipping the switch, turning on the motor, or whatever. And yes, we have demand charges, we have capacity charges, but they don't really reflect in some ways the cost to society of meeting that peak. If this was an airline, we'd be running our planes at roughly 41% of full capacity. Everybody would fly on Thanksgiving at a reasonable price. It would be awesome for me because the rest of the year, as I like to say, I'd be stretched out across 3 seats. And that's just a really inefficient way to run a system, but it's the way we've been doing it now. So next slide, please. If you take a look at this, and this is from Rhode Island's grid mod hearings a couple of years ago, you look at Rhode Island, which is representative of pretty much any utility around the world, certainly in this country. The top 1% of hours in the 8,760 hours in the year, so roughly 87 hours of demand that we meet, represents roughly 9% of total infrastructure spend. So if we could reduce that, find ways to shift that load to other times or eliminate it entirely, we could create some significant economic gravy there, if you will. And if we could cut the top 10% of hours, now we could cut about a quarter of our total infrastructure spend. So if we had a grid that was static, which it's not, the job would be to push this thing down. What we do have instead is a dynamic grid where it's growing all over the place. And so now the question is, how do we grow the grid in a way where we increase that capacity utilization factor? So the question is, there was a movie when I was growing up called Don't Just Raise the Bridge, Lower the River. We're going to have to raise the bridge. There's no question. We're going to have to build infrastructure to accommodate more terawatt hours flowing across the system. At the bulk power system, that's going to happen. And down at the low voltage distribution systems, we're going to see more load as well. The question's going to be now, though, how much can we sort of lower that river? How can we specifically address peak demands and push those down and spread more kilowatt hours across that channel, if you will, by lowering the river, deepening the river, so that we can become more efficient overall in what we're trying to do as a society, generating and delivering electricity that supports the well-being of all of us.
Well, it's certainly a challenge, right? And not only do we have a bridge that needs to be raised, it's also an intermittent bridge, right? In terms of when you can obtain the generation. So that'll be, what are those bridges called that go up and down?
Yeah, the drawbridges.
A drawbridge.
Old, like this one too, they're old. Like the average transformer in the US power system's probably 40, 50 years old today. So that's another piece of the equation we can deal with.
Right. So not only demand, which of course PLMA folks are predominantly focused on, but also the supply and what are the implications of the old bridge related to planning for how to reduce demand and make sure demand and supply match. Well, thanks for setting the stage, Peter. I thought it would be good to think a little bit about a retrospective. As folks might be aware, Peter was a member of PLMA's 2023 Trends webinar. And 2023 was a volatile year. There were a lot of factors that came into play. The California NEM decision changed solar forecasts. There were some high supply chain costs extending from COVID. Some things panned out, some things didn't. In our 2023 webinar, you laid out opportunities and barriers to effectively triple the grid by 2050, foretelling accelerated investment in DERs due to lower costs for those technologies, and also identified several barriers like cybersecurity, our old friend regulatory hurdles, communications capabilities, et cetera, to grid growth and value stacking. What did we learn from 2023? Was your crystal ball accurate?
Yeah, well, everybody's crystal ball has some cracks in it here or there. The future becomes the present at some point, and then it's always different from what we thought it would be. But if you think about it in some ways, so January 1 is an arbitrary date that actually sort of sits in the middle of this constant flow of events and investments and technology and so on. So, but if you break out last year, you can say, yeah, NEM was really critically important because California is responsible for so much solar. And in fact is responsible now for a lot of batteries. What happened there that was really fascinating was because NEM 3.0 reduced the value of export of solar, what it now has done is actually set the stage for more DERs. DERs, let's step back for 1 second. Let's break it up into 4 pieces to define what DERs, at least in my mind. The first one is energy consuming devices that are meant to do something else. They've never woken up in the morning, those DER devices, and said, good, today power prices are going to be X. What can I do? No, it's water heaters, it's air conditioning switches, it's those sorts of end-use devices that we enlist their behavior, take advantage of the fact that we can shift load or somehow manipulate it to make a more efficient grid. Then we also have rooftop solar, which is a passive device. Photons come in, electrons come out. It's distributed. It changes the way the grid operates, but it's not really that manipulable. Pretty passive. Now, though, with NEM 3.0, the third device, which is growing in popularity and population across the grid, is that battery. Yeah, there's grid scale batteries, but increasingly we see more and more located in people's homes. And when you have a NEM 3.0 situation or time of use rate differentials, where when there's lots of solar, you don't get paid much for exporting it, but later on in the day, say in California, 4 to 9 o'clock at night, prices are twice what they were in the middle of the day. Now you create these amazing arbitrage opportunities to store energy at one time and release it, self-consume at other times. Those incentives didn't exist 3 or 4 years ago. So now in the Bay Area, some of the largest companies say that the majority of the solar they're selling now has batteries attached to it. So now we're creating this population of a device that is specifically designed to do what? Absorb and release energy. Not that water heater, not that air conditioner. These things are meant to absorb and release and do it instantaneously. So they can provide frequency regulation if properly harnessed, they can provide capacity, and they can also firm up solar for self-supply. Now you're into a whole new world. And then the fourth piece of this equation are batteries on wheels. They're not meant to store energy for the grid, but they can. And they're huge. Your average battery in a home, 12, 14, 16 kilowatt hours. A small battery in an electric vehicle these days is 40 kWh or 50. The larger ones in the Ford F-150, the little Lightning's 98 kWh, the big one's 130, and the average home uses 30 kWh per day. So these devices now, we have to think about when they charge, how they charge, first of all, and the chargers can be as fast as 350 or 400 kW for a single vehicle. Now, the average grocery store, good-sized grocery store is 300 kW. Right? So now you're bringing all this dynamism there, and we're starting to see the first green shoots and roots being set of vehicle to grid. Between the time you and I spoke, Olivia, we were talking about V2G and what could happen. I read that Veolia in the UK, first 45 garbage trucks, after a pilot, 2 of them delivered 110 kW each into the grid for 2 hours. Now they're going to do 45 of them. And their plan is to electrify all 1,800 vehicles in their garbage hauling fleet and deliver 200 megawatts to the grid. So now there's this whole new phenomenon which we could potentially harness in the future. So when we talk about DERs, we really have to be aware there's a who's who in the zoo we have to think about and start to break those out, because the behaviors, the elasticities, and the economics are going to be really different for each one of these categories.
Absolutely. And I love that you talk about behavior. All too often we sort of think about technology as sort of static. I feel like I've seen a cartoon where, technology changes, people remain the same. And it's a picture of somebody in a spaceship with their coffee on top of the spacecraft, right? And so,
Perfect.
When we talk about these 4 different DERs, it's so critical to think about the customer and the market players in terms of how to set up sort of the financial model. So I'm glad you brought up V2G, because I wanted to pivot into EVs pretty quickly here. We had talked a little bit about what will it take to get V2Gs to move to wider deployment. And we had alluded to some of the financial services models that needed to be engineered to cross the sort of pilot to scale chasm. So you mentioned a little bit in terms of this pilot in the UK. What do you see in terms of financial service models or needs moving forward in 2024 to unlock V2G?
Well, first of all, there's going to be that intermediary, because the individual doesn't have access to, frequency regulation markets or capacity or whatever. There needs to be an aggregator who's posting credit and delivers to the grid and makes those commitments, right? So what's going to happen is those entities will then look at the value stacking opportunities. And this is going to be just like stationary energy storage in the grid, where the first projects generally needed multiple revenue streams in order to pencil. So the first one sold frequency regulation, then they sold capacity, and then they add energy arbitrage in over time. Same sort of thing here is you're going to see the vehicle to grid middleman, if you will, the aggregators, the ones who send the signals and put all those pieces together. They're going to need AI to do it, because you need to know state of charge in each one of the batteries, how old the batteries are, how quickly they can be charged. The chemistries are different if it's lithium iron phosphate versus nickel manganese cobalt versus nickel cobalt aluminum. So you got to know all that stuff, right? Then you need to know when the customer says ixnay on the V2GA, as the Three Stooges would say, can't do it right now because I need that vehicle for something, picking up my kids or whatever. So there are pilots like Kaluza in the UK that has listed a couple hundred players and has done this now for a couple of years in the largest V2G. And they've figured out a lot of this stuff in terms of the apps, customer elasticities, flexibility, willingness to respond to prices, and so on. Now we've got to take this and figure out how do we supersize it. And just as I broke the grid technologies, the DER tech down, now we're going to end up breaking down the vehicles into various classes, because they're driven by different behavioral models and availability. So the first place, like those garbage trucks, why are they so good? Because they pick up all the trash in the morning, and in the evening when the peak takes place, they're sitting at the depot.
Yeah.
School buses. There's 500,000 diesel buses in the country. About 6,000, according to WR, World Resources Institute, are electrified so far. School buses pick up kids from 7 to 9, sit at the depot, and then do the same thing from 2 to 4 in the afternoon. And they take the summers off. and the average battery is 150 to 165 kWh. Bluebird just announced that they doubled their warranty for specifically allow V2G because it makes the economics of the purchase better. And I think they now will allow, was it 300 kilowatt hours to go across the battery over the life of the battery? It was a lot. 300 megawatt hours, excuse me. It was a lot of energy. The battery's 165, so multiple cycles, many multiples of cycles. And we know the first school buses, like the ones in Gardner, Massachusetts, were making like $5,000 a year, delivering 3 megawatt hours during the summer back and forth across the grid. So now the question is, okay, where are the incentives? Certainly we will see the ones from the grid operators, the ISOs and the bulk power system and the STEMs and the Highlands and a whole bunch of DER players right now with their DERM software already know how to monetize some of that. Now the question though is, if we want to make this really healthy, can we look at what's happening on the distribution networks? And that's where the stresses really start to show. Because if you have a lot of EV adoption plus heat pumps and that sort of thing, you have a situation where your transformers, those ones that sit outside our homes that are 40 years old, some of them, now they start to get thermally stressed. And we really have to be thoughtful about what we're doing there, because IEEE had some information that came out recently that said, look, if you charge all your EVs at night, then the liquid in the transformers never gets a chance to cool down. Now we're not just economics, now we're physics, now we're into laws of thermodynamics and all the fun stuff that governs the physical grid. And so they postulated in some models that transformer that could have a 40-year life, if you continuously stress it and never let it cool down because you're charging EVs at night, you actually could reduce the lifespan of that to 4 years. So it's not just the economics in the market outward facing we have to look at. We have to look at the physical stress on the actual equipment we also use. And so this is a very interesting and sophisticated interactive dance that we have to engage in. For some reason, a ghost just turned my camera off, but I overrode that. And back we are again.
I'm glad you mentioned. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No.
I'm
One
glad you
last
mentioned.
piece.
Yeah.
Just the way I overrode the ghost in my machine, put the camera back on. A lot of customers aren't going to be comfortable with this unless they have override capability.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And how the customer will be considering V2G is something I'm certainly very interested in hearing about as more and more demonstrations and programs to lift off. I'm glad you mentioned the distribution grid. So, for EV managed charging, let's go back from V2G back to your simple EV managed charging TOU rates. We found that, with a lot of the different programs that were out there, that the pain and the opportunity of EVs is most meaningfully felt at the distribution system level rather than the bulk power system. So let's say I'm a utility practitioner designing or implementing an EV managed charging program. What do I need to make the case for these programs from a value or cost effectiveness perspective? How do I bridge the gap between program design and future value that may not be there at the moment?
Yeah, so you're looking at avoided cost issues here, and you got to think of a few things. First of all, those transformers, you used to be able to order them in a month or two. Now, because there's only one company in the US that makes the certain grain steel, and because a lot of them are coming to end of life, it can take up to a year to get a transformer, one of the smaller ones. For a substation transformer, can take you up to 150 weeks, 3 years now. Yeah. So you got to plan ahead just for that. Then you got to plan ahead because you got all these fleets that want to come in and put EVs in, and the infrastructure may or may not be there. When one charger, Tesla's truck charger is 750 kW, and just for vehicles, 350 for the ABB one for the Porsche Taycan. Now you got to think about all that. So there's that side of the equation, the supply, and then there's the issue back again to the stresses on the infrastructure and what we need to do. So California PUC had a study that Kivala ran for them and said, in a worst case scenario, if we don't do this right and we don't plan ahead, California alone could incur $50 billion if all transportation were electrified. So the first thing you do is you start to go as a planner, well, let's do an inventory of what our system is out there right now. And where are our transformers physically stressed, or where might they be? Palo Alto did a study like this and looked at it and said, a significant portion of transformers are going to have to be replaced in a full electrification strategy. Seattle City Light and EPRI did a similar sort of study and looked at the thermal stresses on their grid. SMUD, Sacramento Municipal, has done it as well. So what they do is they inventory each one, figure out where the thermal limits are, how close they are, and therefore when the replacements might have to kick in. Now, once you know when that's going to happen, now you have a good sense of what the avoided costs are. Now you could say, okay, if I can forestall the replacement of this device by X number of years through a managed charging program and enlisting other DERs like batteries, et cetera, look at this thing as a system of systems holistically. Now you can say this activity pencils, these incentives pencil, or they don't. But because we now have a situation where we've democratized demand response. When I was a kid back in 2006, when I started the DER or demand response group at Constellation, we already had 60 megawatts that another professional had brought to the game. We were talking about large industrial users that could shed 1 megawatt to 20 megawatts. It was all large industrials. Now, with all the growth of EVs and DERs and solar and heat pumps, et cetera, we also bring in all these DERs. Now we're democratizing the whole thing, right? And we're also creating a two-way highway on this low voltage distribution network that used to be a one-way carriage road. So now basically, as a planner, you have to look at this all and start to do some scenario planning and look at your highs and lows, because nobody knows how this is going to play out. I was teaching a class yesterday, and I was looking at ISO New England's EV forecast. And the 2022 capacity and load transmission report, if my memory serves, was 1.5 million vehicles by 2030. The 2023 KELT report had 2.7. So in 1 year, it jumped up 1.2 million over the original 1.5, which is a healthy percentage. That's the level of uncertainty we're faced with as planners at this small point of adoption. Right? We don't even know yet what those behavioral and adoption cost curves are going to look like, because we still don't see a lot of EVs in the $30,000 range, although Hyundai's EV6 now pencils in at $31,116 with the incentive. So we're starting to get there. So now as a planner, you say to yourself, okay, look, we need as much optionality and flexibility as we can get. The first thing we have to understand is what the heck we have in our system, where those stresses are going to be, and what those costs are going to be to upgrade the system, a la the estimates Cavallo made. Burbank did a really cool thing. Their municipal utility, they looked at all the transformers with the thermal stresses, where they had a lot of overhang and where they didn't. And they actually moved transformers to various places to create more flexibility within the system. So there's a lot of creative ways one can look at this, but it starts with knowing what you have and what you think is going to stress. And it's all scenario planning, because linear doesn't work in this uncertain world.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I think you raised I just saw Mark Martinez make a comment. I didn't see what it was, but it made me think of cylinders of excellence and silo busting. So if I'm the humble utility program designer, it's all about silo busting and organizational practices to make sure that my grid planners and I are communicating about what those cost and value streams are. You raised an interesting point around demand forecasts, as well as DER adoption forecasts, right? So a lot of the news we've been seeing in 2024 feels like sort of negative buzz about EV adoption. We heard about Hertz announcing selling off 20,000 vehicles due to high repair costs, and Tesla slashing their prices, which upended Hertz's model for vehicle resale and profit. We've seen some slowdowns from the automakers, different negative buzz. Is that really true, or is that a headline?
Yeah, so I think one has to always differentiate between the long-term trends and the short-term, headlines, right? The long-term trend is this. First of all, we're dealing with ineluctable climate dynamics, and atmospheric chemistry does not care what the price of an EV is, or indeed what our politics are. And there's nothing that's been more studied in the history of humanity than the climate has, right? There's studies every single day looking at different, take that as a given. Now, the next thing you say is, okay, we have to change our transportation mode. Hydrogen probably doesn't win because it's inefficient, so we're in the battery world. Okay, now, almost every single day, you see some announcement that at a nano level, they figured out how to make the cathode smooth so dendrites can't go across and hit the anode and short out the battery. Or salt-based batteries are now coming into play, so no more cost for lithium, no cost for cobalt. Or the density is going to double, or someone's coming out in 2 years with a solid-state battery that's going to give you twice the density, space and weight. So now your range can go from 300 miles on the vehicle to 6, and now you've eliminated range anxiety. So first, ineluctable given climate. Second one, innovation, especially because supercomputers are getting so much faster every single day. And at the end of the game, the whole grid is all about material science, how we generate, transmit, and consume electricity, and especially in EVs, is all driven by material science. And you've got companies like Contemporary Amperex Technology, makes 34% of the world's batteries, with 1,000 scientists, all with PhDs, on a 40-acre campus in China, chasing everything. And BYD, which has now eclipsed Tesla in terms of EV sales, similar sorts of commitment to R&D and batteries. So anything that these headlines today, Ford pulling back for a little while, Hertz selling its vehicles, it's like in the early days if Henry Ford had an issue with the Model A, and you'd say that, see, I should have stuck with my horse. Like, no, don't confound the short-term things that, are out there creating noise for the signals that we need to be listening to.
Absolutely. Well put. Well, I guess I wanted to move off of EVs and go to something that's been in the news quite a bit and seems to be sort of has a lot of potential for 2024, which is virtual power plants. Post DOE liftoff report, we seem to see announcements everywhere from California to Texas and everywhere in between. How would you sort of characterize how VPPs become game changers, and how does this fit into your model of the 4 different types of DERs? What's it going to take to get there?
Yeah, great question. So the first thing is you're starting to see many of the original VPPs in the battery space. And what in many cases happened was a lot of companies were solar companies, and then they faced net metering issues, and plus they realized customers wanted something, so they became solar and storage companies. And some of them are now storage and solar and EV integration companies. And the idea is you put your arms around the whole thing if you possibly can and maximize your revenues plus the stickiness with the customer. And so, but what you'll see is what we've seen so far. The first VPPs mostly tend to be batteries. STEM has done it for years in California. Now Tesla with the 80 megawatt virtual power plants in Texas, batteries. And the first capacity registered with batteries in ISO New England was behind the meter, Sunrun, SunPower, people like that, right? Then over time, what you'll see is, then there are other companies focused on individual technologies, like there's a company in PJM that just enlists water heaters for frequency regulation of all things. Over time, though, you see these other entities coming in, building the enabling platforms, those broader DERMS platforms that can now take multiple devices and shape them and aggregate them all together and have them complement each other's behavior so that you have a strong dispatchable curve that's pretty predictable. And AI needs to be involved in that because you want to make sure that you have X amount of failure built into it. And you got to have a pretty good sense of locationally what's happening and response to ambient temperatures, a whole lot of other things, right? It's behavioral, but it's highly technological as well. So over time now, you're going to see this increased marriage of the technology companies with the single technologies like batteries, like solar, like water heaters, with the platform companies and the ones that interface with the markets like Enernoc did for years, and now what's NL and C-Power, which was the company we bought and then spun out again as C-Power. So there will be some kind of a convergence there where the umbrella, the platforms, the canopies become broader and more sophisticated.
This imagery of the drawbridge with the river underneath, it's almost like the river needs to become an infinity pool where it's just moving at the same pace and cycling back in, and AI is generating that through this aggregation of different players. Very cool. So we've talked a little bit about value streams for VPPs and EVs and across different flexible load pathways as we move into a sort of DR 3.0 model. What do you think are going to be the key primary value streams in 2024 and moving forward for these different DER pathways?
Yeah, well, first of all, we can hope that FERC Order 2222 picks up a little bit momentum in terms of the implementation, because we need those signals from the bulk market, right? The bulk power market. And 2222, almost everyone on the call knows it, but to simplify it, the FERC told every grid operator except for Texas, because they can't talk to Texas, because Texas doesn't move power across state lines, no interstate commerce. They said to them, thou shalt treat aggregations of 100 kW or more as any other resource and compensated the same as any other resource in wholesale markets. But then they said, you have to come back to us with the rules in terms of how you are going to aggregate those. And also, what's the communication going to be like with the distribution utility? Because unlike the bulk power system, right, all these devices are located in the low voltage system. And let's say CAISO calls for 100 megawatts of batteries in a very short period of time because it's facing some kind of duress and needs the supply. Well, what if the distribution utility doesn't know where these highly concentrated assets are being dispatched? And now you have this bidirectional flow that in some cases might even be possible to move because there could be physical constraints. In other cases, could destabilize the grid. So we not only have to think about the prices, first bulk power, then the situational awareness, and then there's this whole another second layer of prices, which many people believe is going to be more valuable and more important than the bulk power system. And that is all those avoided costs and the efficiencies in the distribution system layer. Because if we do this wrong, we're going to jack up those peaks and need to build that bridge higher for floods that only occur, once a year in terms of peak demand, if you will, to kill that metaphor, versus having the bridge just above the current most of the year, right? And so we really have to be aware of what value streams are happening in that system and in the distribution system. And the best use case still that anyone talks about is Con Ed, Brooklyn Queens Demand Management Project, where a bunch of yuppies moved into that area to oversimplify. And they like to party at night to further oversimplify. And the peak shifted to 6 to 10, 11 o'clock at night. And so Con Ed was looking at, well, what are we going to do? $1.2 billion for a substation and feeders. And instead, they said, well, what if we put in fuel cells, energy efficiency, demand response, some solar, some batteries, and some voltage management? What would that cost? And the last I looked, which was about a year ago, it was $116.5 million. So a tenth the price. So there are many instances out there, and New York does this all the time now, says before you build anything new, utilities, you got to prove that you need it and that it might not be cheaper or isn't cheaper to do that through some other mechanisms, whether it's building distributed storage or demand response or a combination of both.
So slightly related, a little bit off to the side, DER interconnection queues. How does that fit into meeting that challenge? We've heard a bit about some slowdowns there in terms of getting the interconnection process through.
Yeah, and it's way different from the bulk power one, but it has its own sort of similar characteristics in that ultimately you need to know what the impact of those devices are on your infrastructure. Right? If you want to put a whole bunch of batteries in, et cetera, can you flow the power? Can you do? So what's the hosting capacity? And then what is the ability to interconnect? And there are some states like New York where they have hosting capacity maps and you can actually see where the spare capacity is or isn't. And when I was in the grid mod case in Rhode Island, the vendors were arguing, hey, if you make this information available to us as vendors, where the constraints are, we are primed, because it's our business, to deliver you the solutions. So part of how this gets better is if the partnership were more fully formed. And the place that probably does that the best, even though there's some stress right now around solar, is Hawaii, where HECO broke apart its traditional integrated resource planning process. And in 2016 started planning a new one where they said, we're going to enlist the distributed side, the distributed asset side into the planning process and make them a full partner. And we know that we could get 20, 30, 40% or more of our energy from the customer side of the meter. And so they specifically realigned the planning process and the internal organization to better account for the potential there, the silo busting thing we were alluding to before. Because ultimately, what the customer care conversation is like impacts what the transmission conversation and distribution conversation and gen conversation, these are all systems of systems, and they needed to be treated and integrated as such.
And that's great. And I love the idea of thinking about the systems and systems approach, whether it's thinking about from the customer perspective, the market perspective, the grid perspective, and how all that gets planned and adopted. And it seems like with FERC 2x4, movement is a bit afoot, but not as far along across different dimensions in terms of bringing that together.
Well, part of it is like, yes, the FERC is telling people to do that, but where's the carrot and where's the stick? And there is and to be fair, there's an awful lot of uncertainty, and this doesn't fit into the culture of grid operators. They're used to doing transmission and gen management and planning, and this is something completely different. And it also involves a whole heck of a lot of communication with the distribution side across that P node to that low voltage system. So, there's a lot. Yes, thou shalt is pretty easy to do, the one of the 10 commandments. How that actually gets enacted is somewhat more challenging. So
yeah.
To be fair, it is, but then there's probably also some foot dragging as well with MISO, for example, saying, oh, we'll get back to you in 10 years. No, with the pace of change required now, with the technology that's out there, and the sheer fact that this is becoming a cyber physical entity, the grid, it just is. There's not really that kind of an excuse for that period of time.
So I wanted to ask a little bit, we've talked a bit about the bulk power and distribution system level value streams. What about other value streams outside of that area, like carbon and affordability? Do you think that those are sort of value streams that will be important or addressed moving forward in terms of thinking about DER adoption and program and portfolio implementation?
Well, so the thing about DERs, except for solar, which is its own unique animal, and you can call it a DER because of where it's located, but it's really a power plant on somebody's roof, right? It's not dispatchable per se, although you can program the inverters to provide frequency regulation. Certainly with a bulk power solar system, they do it already. But what you got to do is actually, can you sort of rephrase the first part of that question again? Because I was going one way and I want to make sure I end up in the right spot.
Oh, well, I think whatever spot you go in is probably great.
No.
But I think when we were chatting before, we were talking a little bit about carbon and how DERs enable decarbonization.
Yeah. So here's the thing. All these other devices, solar generates energy and it's carbon-free energy, so we can get a carbon credit. All these other devices, what they're meant to do is shift energy, right? Or reduce consumption at certain periods of time. So there's not a lot of kWh and avoided fuel costs associated. Now there's an enabling capability. For example, if you don't have batteries, maybe the solar doesn't go in. But if you just isolate the battery itself, whether it's in an EV or in someone's garage, it actually can be a net consumer because a battery has, your typical lithium ion battery, 90% round trip efficiency. So that single asset broken off by itself, not thought of in a systems of system approach, if you just thought about the carbon piece, you'd punish it, which would be a perverse outcome.
Right. Yeah.
Right. And so really the battery or a lot of DERs themselves, they don't have much of a carbon impact for the most part. But what they do is create the flexibility that allows the rest of the grid to become cleaner and more efficient. And so I don't know how you value the enabling capability without which, for example, you can integrate about 30% renewables into a grid by just flexing the gas resources harder, cycling more often. Once you get beyond that, you have to enlist assets like storage and DERs to get to, say, 60%, and then you need longer term duration storage, the 12 hours, the 100 hours sort of thing. So that 30 to 60, that next step of decarbonization, which we're entering now in many of our grids, that's where DERs come in really helpful. But how you assign a carbon value for that depends upon a whole heck of a lot of assumptions.
Yeah, there's this sort of dance between intermittent renewables and load flexibility and how they can enable each other. But to my knowledge, I haven't seen much in the way of frameworks to unlock carbon enablement or other metrics to think about these outside of the silos of the traditional programs that they might be offered under, whether it's energy efficiency or demand response or something else. So it's sort of a fascinating time to think about metrics and what types of metrics might be important to consider when you're trying to get to raising a bridge and lowering the water, and they're not distinct things. You can't separate a river, right? So that's sort of interesting. Another metric we were sort of talking about that's outside of the area is a bit about affordability, right? There's a lot of conversations about decarbonization and rates and affordability. There's been some concerns about how EV charging will raise electric rates. There's been a couple studies that came out that showed that load growth caused by EV charging can actually reduce electricity prices because EV charging can spread fixed electricity system costs over a larger volume of sales, mostly reducing per kilowatt hour rates. What do you think about the larger question of decarbonization, DERs, and affordability? What is that going to look like for 2024? Any just thoughts you might have? It's kind of a big question to unpack.
No, well, it's an interesting question and it's an important one. So if you think about the first major decarbonization technologies we've adopted at scale, the tens of thousands of megawatts of solar and rooftops in California, the first electric vehicles. Almost all of the adopters of solar are by definition higher income because they own homes. They can either afford to finance it themselves or they're credit worthy. So the sun runs and the sun powers and the Sonans and others come in and see them as creditworthy entities and will do a lease or a purchase power agreement. The folks who live in multifamily housing, which are typically lower income, they're there for 2 or 3 years. They don't have equity in the place. What do you do there? Now, you can do things like community solar, where you put, 1,000 panels in a field somewhere, 5,000 panels, and everyone gets fractional offtake or ownership. And so if someone moves out of an apartment, the next person who comes in picks up the same account number, still has that 15% or 10% credit or something like that. Let's say there are ways you can do it, but we still haven't really cracked the code on widespread spreading of benefits of decarbonization, distributed decarbonization tech around solar to lower income. Same thing with electric vehicles. The average EV out there is, $50,000, $60,000, $70,000. There's about 40 of them that are under $45,000. And that's when you have like 2 GM bolts of different models. And so, there are really only a handful of vehicles out there in the $30,000 range. And so again, we have tended to focus, and early adoption curves are generally like this with most tech. They start off with well-to-do people and then they trickle down as scale comes up and costs come down. And the thinking and the hope here is that with batteries, for example, costs will continue to come down volumetrically over time. And then you have like the federal tax incentive where a used EV gets a $3,000, I think it's $3,000, maybe it's $3,500 if you're within certain income limits and the vehicle can be shown to be X or Y or Z. So there are some moves afoot to make EVs more affordable. And then you got to think about the charging infrastructure. We can't create, just like we have food deserts in cities, we have charging deserts in certain areas. And so we have to think about where we're going to put the charges. And of course, if a vendor's there, if they don't see a population of vehicles, they're not going to put it there. So this again is a place where public policy can be helpful to locate chargers and stimulate areas of the economy that otherwise don't benefit.
Thank you for that. So I know you are focused on, I know you've written a book on the grid and now you're focused on systems and systems. I guess I wanted to ask you, without reflection, we go blindly on our way. What should we consider as humble practitioners to move towards optimal rather than ad hoc outcomes on the energy transition journey? Are there any organizational, regulatory, customer, or market considerations that you think are critical moving forward to get to the heightened bridge and lowered river from a systems perspective?
Yeah, so I mean, you could start with how the utilities typically think about their efficiency programs, where they have the rate impact test and the societal benefit test and total cost test and so on. That's a start. But then what you got to have in there is the carbon piece of that equation, and some kind of societal value of carbon that actually reflects the damage that every marginal ton of carbon is, creating right now. I saw something this morning on LinkedIn where someone was talking about, in Bitcoin, we're creating the future. And I felt compelled to write, you can't create that future if you don't think about the future of the people who are unborn that are going to suffer the consequences of the Bitcoin mining emissions, burning tires, electricity, et cetera, and everything else we do, right? So we're 8 billion people on this planet. Our economic systems reach almost everywhere across the world. When it was just a small population, we could do whatever we wanted and the world was big enough. Now we can't do that anymore. And so we really have to think much more holistically on what are the unintended consequences. And yeah, it's a pain. It's much more difficult. And we can't think in silos anymore. We have to think about, if we do this, what are the things that may result from that, and what are the harms we may cause, and start to balance these out and try and make Solomon-like decisions. They're not going to be easy. There's going to be room for disagreement, but we have to come at this with a good faith effort, as informed as we possibly can be, with open minds, and recognizing that we're going to be wrong. Sometimes you're going to have to shift course, and being wrong isn't always a mistake. Being wrong sometimes means I'm wise enough to recognize that didn't work. And so I'm going to move over to this, even though I know someone's going to play gotcha on me, right? Which is not helpful. So, my plea is that we recognize this is really hard. It has huge challenges and enormous opportunities. It involves a lot of sharing. It involves a lot of pilots. It's going to involve failure because it has to, because we've never done this before. What we need to do is learn from those fail fast, not die by pilots, and figure out what works and then how to replicate it really, really quickly, because the time's running out on the carbon budget.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, wow, that was very powerful. Thank you for sharing that. And actually, we've kind of gone through most of the questions that I was going to ask. So I was thinking we could go to some audience Q&A, unless, Peter, there was something we neglected to cover.
No, let's play Stump the Chump. I always love that.
Okay. Judy or Rich, is there something that popped up that you feel like merits the top of the list from our audience questions?
So, Peter, our mutual friend Ross is asking, what impact do you think the lack of harmonization between the electricity industry and electrified transportation industry will have on grid resiliency and availability of capacity and delivery?
Yes, thank you. And
so again, yeah. The industry silos, right?
Yeah. Thank you. And it's something I forgot to mention. I'm a member of a group called Collaborative Utility Solutions, and I'm just on the advisory board. And what this is, it's an effort, and they've spoken to almost all the state commissioners. The idea is to create a universal registry, the same way everyone has a social or every car has a VIN, so you know what the vehicle is. So that, for example, if you had vendor A and they were dealing with these population of batteries, and then they got sold to somebody else or went out of business or the contract expired, vendor B could pick up those devices and they'd still have that unique identifier. And so the beauty of that would then be that whoever needed to know that information, so the ISOs, the grid operators, would need to know, oh, it's a battery made by Samsung, it's 15 kWh, and it's located here. And of course, the distribution utilities would want to know that. And here's my EV with this, and here's my water heater, and so on. If we had this universal registration capability and with permission-based views, we could create a much more efficient system than we're about to do right now. Because what we're doing right now is we're building out a spoke and hub system where every vendor has its own relationships, unique relationships with its devices, but nobody else knows where those devices are or what they're doing. There's no recipe for situational awareness, but there is a recipe for inefficiency and blindness. And so a universal registry could really help a lot with that. Knowing the where and the what and the how much, and for the how long all these potential devices could be available on a GIS type of map. That would be really helpful.
Did California just initiate some law to do that in the state of California? I feel like I saw some headlines maybe a month or two about that.
There may be. It's the name of the group is Collaborative Utility Solutions. Okay. And part of the challenge is in California and New York are so far down the road, each with their own state level one, that now you're creating a Tower of Babel already, right? And what we really need is not French and English and German, but Esperanto.
Thank you, Peter. Rich, do you have another one lined up, or should I choose?
Yes, no, but okay. One that was asked earlier in the session. So, question was from Omar asking: are any utilities using distributed energy resources such as batteries to improve power quality at the customer or on the low voltage network?
Yeah, the power to quality issue. I'm not aware of any utilities looking at it. I'm aware of, for example, grid operators that have enlisted batteries and now water heaters for power quality, frequency reg, that sort of thing at the, say, PJM level. But I don't know of any utilities that are now specifically doing that. And it could be that there are. I'm just not aware of any. I haven't seen anything in the press.
Okay. Another question is could you share the name of the group that's working on the universal registry with the state commissions?
Yeah, it just popped up on the screen. It's screen. It's Collaborative Utility Solutions.
Got it. Yeah. Thank you. Let's see. That was a bunch of them.
I might offer one, Rich, if that's okay. Yeah.
Please.
What role, we didn't have a chance to talk about rates. We kind of cut it because we thought we'd be pressed for time. But I wanted to ask, what role will dynamic electric pricing have for load management technologies? What do you think that'll look like in 2024?
Yeah, so I mean, we see certainly places like California have rolled out with time of use rates for a while. And certainly rates can help because they create elastic behavior. When somebody pays twice as much to charge an EV at a certain time of day than another, they typically will switch and charge it to the cheapest periods. The challenge of rolling out time-dependent rates is you've got to also have the enabling technologies where people can respond. And I'll give you an example. I was trained as an economist and I love the phrase perverse outcomes. And so I'm going to give you a good one. So for a while, there was a utility in Kentucky called Glasgow Municipal Utility. And it had one year, about 10 years ago, more batteries per capita than any other utility in the country. And Billy Ray, who was the head of it, he said, you know, the reason we put all the storage in is because we pay KU and Tennessee Valley Authority about 50% of our total overall wholesale cost for demand and the open access transmission charges and tariff, the OITT. So he had batteries, and then they made what was strategically a mistake. And I'd written about this in Forbes, how cool they were. Well, then they said, let's take those capacity, the exposure to capacity, and let's put it into kWh prices. So they said our price per kilowatt hour on a weighted average for these hours is going to be like $1. And so now we'll send a signal to customers so they'll change their behavior when prices are that high. Well, when are those prices going to be that high? During the hottest hours of the day. And so I got this irate email from a couple in their 80s, fixed income, who said, thanks to people like you, meaning me, you know, and Billy Ray, we now have a situation where we can't afford to put our air conditioner on when we desperately need it the most, and we're in ill health, but we simply can't afford to anymore. That is a classic example of a perverse outcome. You can't foist the economic scarcity scheme on people without giving them ample warning and making sure they have the technologies and the tools to do something about it. So it's lovely to take scarcity pricing or hourly pricing and put it to a business, especially if you give them enough lead time. Individuals who have less elasticity, less flexibility, that can be a really dangerous situation. In fact, in a worst case situation, it could kill people. Right? Because if they have no AC in a really extreme period, bad things can happen. So we have to be really thoughtful about how we're rolling these out, to whom we're rolling them out, and what's the delta. And also, if you have a price that one day, imagine if you went to the gas pump and one day the price of gas, they actually paid you to fill the tank, and the next day it was $150 a gallon. That's what Texas is right now, right? That kind of real-time pricing doesn't serve anybody well at all. And just think about the political backlash you'd face. So yeah, there's some value in having some real-time pricing, maybe, but you've got to be really thoughtful how you roll this out and what it actually means to the consumer.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, Peter, because perverse outcomes, negative externalities, love the terms for all these sorts of things. But I think we always get left with, what about the customer after we have these kind of macro level conversations about, you know, where we need to go from a climate perspective, when we think about markets, when we think about value streams. And so thinking about what the customer can tolerate and what's to their benefit and how not homogenous the customer really is. Associated with these different DERs is really important and critical. Rich, do we have any more? Because I can keep going about the customer ad nauseum.
You've probably got 2 minutes here to ask one more thing about the customer.
Okay, let's see. Well, I want to make sure that we cover. Let's see. So in terms of the customer, we talked about getting EVs to the right price. We talked about being able to share the right market signals. What types of customer incentives do we need to, what do we need to know about customers and incentives? And is the incentive always financial? What do you think that's going to look like? Are we going to move beyond a financial incentive model moving forward?
You know, it's interesting. I'm teaching a class right now on electric vehicles, and one of the slides is, what's the major reason you adopted an EV? And the first one is environmental. So there's a case right there, right, where it's a non-price, it's an externality that's motivating them, something that's not put into the price. And but for the most part, though, most people will respond to prices. But the thing is, I think in many cases, customers are already so busy dealing with so many things over the course of the day. They don't want to know this stuff. They don't want to care about it. If a third party comes in and says, here's the value prop. If you let me use your vehicle and I guarantee you're going to have X number of miles of range at any time, but I can sell frequency regulation services or capacity or something else into the grid with my wonderful AI system that's self-learning, blah, 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 and guarantee you all that, would you let me do that? And we know from the use cases like the cars in Burrillville, Rhode Island, that Fermata and National Grid had, that Nissan Leaf was making $5,000 a year. Now, that's on the high side, but in the UK, vehicles selling frequency regulation, grid balancing services are making $1,000 a year. That's not chump change for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Just, hands off, don't mess with my transportation, guarantee me the availability, and you can play with that thing as much as you want the rest of the time. I think you keep it really simple, stupid for the customer and make a compelling value proposition where they get free money for doing nothing in their minds.
Right. Yeah. Make sure that proposition is there. Well, this has been so wonderful, Peter. I learn every time I speak with you about something. This time I learned quite a bit. So I really appreciate the time you took to talk about 2024 trends. And thank you, Judy and Rich, for the opportunity to contribute.
Well, thank you. It's always a pleasure. As you can tell, I love this stuff.
Me too.
We can tell you guys both love this stuff. This was a fabulous conversation. Thank you so much. It feels like I need to listen to it 3 more times to make sure we picked up all the little pieces and nuances. And if you feel like me and you want to hear it another couple of times, PLMA does have a podcast, and you can pick up the PLMA podcast wherever you get your podcasts. In addition, you can also go to our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/@PLMADR, and we will have this recording up on that channel probably in the next day or so. So please consider listening again. Next, I want to let everybody know who's a PLMA member in our audience that we have 2 virtual meetups coming up in the next couple of weeks. One will be with our commercial and industrial load flexibility group. A second will be with our customer engagement group, who will be talking about customer retention issues. And if you'd like to participate in those, please go to PLMA's calendar, which is on our website, which is PLMA, sorry, no, it's not. It's peakload.org/calendar. And the next thing I want to mention is we are getting many questions at the moment about when do the awards start? When are we taking nominations for the awards? That is coming up later this month. In a couple of weeks on January 29th, we'll be opening our request for nominations for awards. So please stay tuned for that. That will be on the website, in the newsletter, and every other place we can find a place to put it, LinkedIn and so forth. And we look forward to hearing about the great projects that are deserving of recognition. And of course, the other question we get a lot at the moment is, hey, when's the next conference? And we're excited to tell you that the 49th PLMA conference will be May 6th to 8th in Portland, Oregon. And we will be announcing the agenda and opening registration sometime in mid-February. So not too far from now, but wanted to keep that on everybody's radar for the future. And as we draw to the end of today's terrific webinar, thank you again, everyone who joined us. You have been listening to a Load Management Dialogue presented by PLMA. To learn a bit about upcoming dialogues and other activities and webinars that we have going on, also for past recordings, please visit us at peakload.org or your favorite podcast platform. And this concludes this edition. Thank you and have a good rest of your day.